What would you do if the person you trusted most turned out to be a cold-blooded killer? This is the question that seemed unthinkable to many, yet it's a tragic reality for Katie Rose Fusco. A story of family reuniting, of lost connections, and a bond that would lead to unimaginable horror. In the quiet suburbs of North Carolina, one man's obsession led to an act of violence that shocked an entire nation. Steven Pladl's story is one that explores the darkest depths of manipulation, incest, and betrayal. It's a twisted tale of a father's love turned fatal, and a daughter lost in a world where nothing was ever as it seemed. Before we begin, our hearts go out to the family and loved ones of Katie Rose and her mother, as well as the entire family affected by the actions of Steven Pladl, whose lives have been forever altered by this tragic event. Welcome to True Crime Diaries, where we delve into the most chilling and heart-wrenching cases, uncovering the dark truths behind the headlines and bringing the stories of victims and their families to light. If you find these stories gripping and want to stay informed, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Share your thoughts and reactions with us in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going as we seek justice for those whose voices have been silenced. This is a story about a reunion that should have never happened, of a father and daughter reconnecting only to tear apart the very fabric of family. A child, born from a forbidden relationship, becomes the symbol of a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Their lives forever altered, each decision spiraling into a deadly outcome. Before the tragic events of 2018, Steven Pladl's life was marked by troubling behavior that seemed to build a foundation for the eventual horrors. His story with his wife, the mother of his biological children, began long before his reunion with Katie. In fact, it began when Steven was already exhibiting manipulative tendencies. Steven met his future wife, the mother of his children, in the early stages of his adulthood. Their relationship was far from conventional. In fact, it became clear early on that Steven's sense of boundaries and morality were seriously flawed. When he met his wife, she was just a teenager, not yet of legal age, but Steven's influence over her would prove to be more controlling than anyone realized at the time. At first, their relationship appeared to be that of any other young couple in love. But as time went on, Steven's darker tendencies started to emerge. He began to manipulate her emotionally and physically. His controlling nature was evident in his interactions with her. It was clear that Steven wanted to dominate every aspect of her life, an alarming sign of the obsessive behavior that would later unfold in his relationship with Katie. Before his wife became an adult, Steven impregnated her, starting a pattern of unhealthy and disturbing behavior that would continue into his later relationships. Their relationship quickly escalated into something that resembled an unbalanced power dynamic, with Steven holding all the control. Katie's birth was a significant moment in Steven's life. However, rather than the joy of fatherhood, it marked the beginning of his manipulative and abusive tendencies becoming more pronounced. Steven's unhealthy attachment to his family, particularly to his daughter, was already forming. When Katie was born, Steven's behavior toward her was disturbing from the outset. While there were no immediate signs of extreme violence, those who were close to him soon noticed an unsettling pattern. One of the most disturbing aspects of his treatment of Katie, as she grew older, was the way he would frequently pinch her, seemingly for no reason. This behavior, which might have seemed trivial to some, was part of a broader pattern of control and manipulation. Katie's mother, who had been deeply troubled by Steven's behavior, started to realize the gravity of the situation. She had hoped that the birth of their daughter would bring about some sense of stability, but instead, Steven's actions only became more erratic and abusive. Katie's mother, in an interview years later, said, "I never wanted to give her up. But Steven, his attitude towards her was something I could never understand. I saw him treat her so poorly. He was always pinching her, making her feel small. I knew I couldn't give her a healthy home if he was around. I had to protect her, even if it meant letting her go." Katie's mother, distraught and powerless, made the painful decision to put her daughter up for adoption. She believed that Katie deserved a chance at a better life, free from the abuse she was witnessing. The trauma of that decision would stay with her for years, but she knew it was the only way to give Katie a future where she could grow up in a safe, loving environment, away from Steven's disturbing influence. Katie was placed into a new family, one that loved her and took her in as their own. Her adoptive parents raised her in a safe, supportive environment, far away from Steven and the toxic atmosphere he had created. However, even though she was far removed from Steven's immediate influence, the scars of that early childhood would remain with her forever. But it wasn't just the crimes that shocked the world, it was the way it unfolded. A series of decisions, failures in the system, and the haunting question of how something so twisted could happen under the radar. It was a quiet morning in 2018 when the first sign of what would become an unimaginable crime surfaced.
And it would just instantly trigger him. He would curse, he would tell me to shut her the hell up. He would at times scoop her up and place her into a big cooler that we had. And then sometimes he would just shut it tight. He knew it was possible she could be dead, and he was not fazed by it. So I would finally go back there and open it and get her out.
Steven Pladl, a 43-year-old man from Knightdale, North Carolina, had a life that seemed, on the surface, as ordinary as any other. He was a father to a young child, a man with a job, and a seemingly stable family life. But everything was not as it appeared. Katie was adopted by a family in Connecticut. Raised in a safe and loving home, she grew up with the love of adoptive parents who cared for her as their own. But in 2016, when Katie turned 18, she decided to search for her biological parents, unaware of the twisted history she was about to uncover. When she found Steven, their reunion should have been one of joy, a moment to reconnect with a father she never knew. But instead, it would be the beginning of a nightmare that neither of them could escape from. They reunited under the guise of rekindling their lost father-daughter bond. But within months, the relationship would take a disturbing turn. They crossed a line that no one should ever cross, and the impact of their actions would ultimately destroy the very thing they sought to rebuild. Their relationship, which began as one of emotional healing, soon became sexual. A deep and disturbing intimacy blossomed between them. What started as a search for identity and a quest for belonging became something dark, an incestuous connection that would lead to one of the most tragic crimes in modern American history. Steven's wife didn't actually realize what was happening until after the divorce. Her two younger daughters, just 11 and 6 years old, were living with her at the time, though she allowed them to occasionally visit their father. It was during these visits that the children began to notice something deeply disturbing between their father and Katie. But when they tried to speak up, their father threatened them into silence. The truth didn't fully come to light until one day the mother stumbled upon her 11-year-old daughter's diary. In it, the young girl had written detailed entries about what she had seen, what was really going on between her father and Katie. Horrified, the mother confronted her ex-husband and immediately reported everything to the police. But to her absolute shock, instead of being ashamed or remorseful, the man and Katie went a step further. They decided to get married. In early 2018, Steven and Katie's relationship was discovered. It was a revelation that would send shockwaves through their families and the community. But by then, the damage had already been done. Steven and Katie were arrested on charges of incest, but even this legal trouble didn't stop their connection. Despite court orders prohibiting them from having contact, Steven and Katie continued their forbidden relationship. As Katie became pregnant, the situation grew even more complex and dangerous. Katie's son, Bennett, was born in 2018, and Steven was granted temporary custody. This was where the story took an even darker turn. On April 12, 2018, in a chilling act that no one could have predicted, Steven Pladl killed his 7-month-old son, Bennett. The authorities were unaware of the true nature of the relationship at the time, and it was only after the tragic death of the child that the full extent of the nightmare began to unravel. With Bennett dead, Steven didn't stop there. He drove from North Carolina to Connecticut, where Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, lived. There, Steven murdered Katie and Anthony Fusco in cold blood before fleeing the scene. After the murders, Steven's descent into madness was complete. He took his own life in New York, ending his own existence after destroying everything he had once known. The investigation began almost immediately, and the authorities pieced together the events leading up to the tragic murders. Detectives discovered that Steven's actions were not impulsive, but the culmination of a series of choices that led him further down a dark path. The authorities had been aware of the incestuous relationship and had issued court orders to prevent contact between Steven and Katie. But the system failed to stop what seemed like an inevitable tragedy. Despite the warnings, no one could have predicted the extent to which Steven would go to keep his daughter in his life, even if it meant murder. When Steven's body was discovered in New York, the investigation turned from a hunt for a fugitive to an examination of how such a horrific series of events could have unfolded. The authorities were left to ponder whether the case could have been prevented. Had they done enough to intervene in time? Could more have been done to protect the victims? The case concluded with the deaths of Steven, Katie, and Bennett, and the murder of Anthony Fusco. The story ended in tragedy, leaving behind broken families and unanswered questions. But the broader implications of the case were far-reaching. The failure of the legal system to intervene, the lack of proper resources to prevent such an extreme act of violence, and the devastating psychological damage done to Katie were all part of a complex narrative that still leaves investigators and the public struggling for answers. Katie Fusco, who had been manipulated and coerced into a horrific relationship with her father, had her life taken from her. Her adoptive family, who had raised her with love and care, were left to mourn the loss of their daughter in a way no one could have foreseen. This case is one that raises more questions than answers. How could this happen? What went wrong? And how can we prevent something like this from ever happening again? Steven Pladl was no stranger to control. Throughout his life, he had held on to relationships in a way that could only be described as manipulative. But nothing prepared him for his reunion with Katie. What began as a simple attempt to reconnect with his daughter quickly turned into something darker. Their conversations were initially tender, with Steven trying to bond with Katie. But soon, the emotional connection was replaced by something sinister. Steven: "Katie, I've missed you so much. I've been waiting for this day for years." Katie: I've waited too. I wanted to know who you were, where I came from." Steven: "You don't know what it's been like, watching you grow up from afar. I've thought about you every day." For Katie, who had always wondered about her biological parents, the reunion felt like the closure she needed. She didn't know that it would turn her life upside down. Slowly, Steven's affection for her became more intense, crossing lines she didn't understand. He manipulated her into believing they were destined to be together. Katie, confused and desperate for answers about her past, found herself pulled into a web of emotional and psychological manipulation. Katie: "I feel like everything's falling into place now. I feel whole." But with each word spoken, Steven was reasserting control. He wasn't just her father anymore. He had become her lover, her emotional anchor in a world where she no longer knew where she belonged. Katie's feelings of guilt and confusion were compounded by Steven's manipulation. He convinced her that what they were doing wasn't wrong, that they were two lost souls meant to be together. As their relationship grew more intense, Steven's hold on Katie tightened. It wasn't just a father-daughter reunion anymore. It was something more twisted, born out of Steven's deep-seated need for control and possession. Katie's world was slowly closing in. She had reconnected with her father, but this was not the father she had imagined. As she became pregnant with his child, everything changed. The pregnancy symbolized more than just a future. It symbolized Steven's complete dominance over her life. "Steven, you're carrying my child. We'll never be apart now, Katie. This is what we were meant to do." Katie's mind was clouded by the manipulation and the deep emotional turmoil she was experiencing. Her sense of right and wrong blurred, and she found herself unable to break free from Steven's grasp. She was trapped, and her future seemed destined to be one that mirrored Steven's toxic hold on her. Katie had been living a double life. On one side, she was the loving daughter of two adoptive parents who cared for her deeply. On the other side, she was entwined in a dark and abusive relationship with the man who should have protected her the most. When the authorities were finally alerted to their situation, it was only after Katie's pregnancy had been confirmed. The realization hit hard. Steven's lies were no longer enough to shield him from the law. He was arrested along with Katie, both facing charges of incest. But what happened next shocked everyone. Even after their arrests, Steven and Katie continued their relationship. Despite a court order to keep them apart, Steven manipulated Katie into thinking their bond was too powerful to break. They defied the law, continuing their connection in secrecy. At this point, the investigation into their actions began to spiral into a web of disturbing questions. How had no one noticed the warning signs earlier? How could a father and daughter have slipped through the cracks for so long? This wasn't just a case of family betrayal. It was a failure of the legal system to intervene before things escalated to murder. Steven Pladl, emboldened by the lack of consequences, took a final devastating step. April 12, 2018, was a fateful day. The authorities had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of Steven and Katie's relationship, but this would soon change. Steven had been granted temporary custody of his infant son, Bennett. Bennett's birth had already been a point of contention, a product of a relationship that should never have existed. The details of what happened that day remain chillingly unclear. But one thing is certain: Steven killed Bennett, his own child, in cold blood. The infant, just 7 months old, was a symbol of the twisted relationship between Steven and Katie. But in Steven's mind, Bennett was also a threat to his control. The child represented something more than a mere connection between father and daughter. He was a reminder of the world that Steven had carefully constructed around Katie. The murder of Bennett was only the beginning. Afterward, Steven traveled to Connecticut, intent on finishing what he had started. His next targets were Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco. Are you as shocked as I am by the twisted manipulation Steven used to control Katie? If you're still reeling from this unimaginable tragedy, hit that like button and comment below with your thoughts on how this situation could have been stopped. Do you think the legal system failed Katie? Let's talk about it. The investigation into Steven Pladl's crime was far from over, but what we know now is this: the consequences of their actions would destroy everything in their path. From a reunion that should have never happened to the murders of an innocent child, a daughter, and a father, the horror of Steven's plan was devastating. But what drove Steven to take such extreme actions? Was it a lifetime of resentment? A twisted desire for control? Or was there something deeper, a psychological flaw that pushed him to take the lives of those closest to him? The first significant breakthrough came after the bodies of Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, were found in Connecticut. Detectives immediately began connecting the dots between Steven's movements and the brutal murder scene. They had received reports of Steven's custody of Bennett, and after hearing that the child had been found dead in North Carolina, investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with a family massacre. As the police continued to investigate, they turned to Steven's digital footprint. They found messages between him and Katie that revealed the deep emotional manipulation at play. It was clear that Steven had never seen himself as a parent. He had seen Katie as someone he needed to possess, Katie, too, was a victim of Steven's emotional abuse. But in her isolation, she seemed to fall into the trap, unable to break free. As the investigation into the murders continued, the psychological profile of Steven Pladl became more alarming. Experts weighed in on his behavior and the signs of manipulation he exhibited. It was clear that Steven wasn't just controlling in the typical sense. He was obsessed. His relationship with Katie had all the hallmarks of a deeply disturbed mind. He didn't just want to reunite with his daughter, he wanted her for himself, body and soul. When the news broke about the murders of Katie and her adoptive father, it sent shockwaves through the community. The tragedy was far-reaching, affecting not only the families involved, but also the legal and social systems tasked with protecting vulnerable individuals. Katie's adoptive family, especially her adoptive mother, was left devastated by the loss. They had raised Katie as their own, never knowing that her biological father was someone capable of such extreme violence. Their grief was compounded by the sense of betrayal. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they had also lost the trust they had in the system that failed to protect her. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the aftermath was the loss of Bennett, the 7-month-old infant caught in the crossfire of his parents' twisted relationship. Bennett was an innocent child, taken before he even had the chance to live. His death was a symbol of the destruction wrought by Steven's obsessive need to control those around him. Katie's adoptive family would never fully recover from the horror they had witnessed. Their grief was compounded by their inability to protect Katie from the man who should have loved her the most. They had always hoped that Katie's reunion with her biological father would bring healing, but instead, it brought unimaginable pain. Katie, too, became a tragic figure in this case. She was not just a victim of her father's violence. She was a victim of a system that failed her at every turn. Her emotional journey from a young girl searching for her identity to a woman caught in the grips of manipulation is one that many find deeply tragic. She had no way of knowing the extent of her father's dysfunction, nor could she have known the terrible price she would pay for her search for connection. Her adoptive family member said she was just trying to find herself. She was trying to understand who she was, and in the process, she lost everything. It breaks my heart to think of what she went through. Katie's death left behind more than just grief. It left behind the unanswerable question: could anyone have saved her? Could the authorities have intervened earlier? Could she have broken free from the web of control Steven had so expertly woven around her? The questions that still linger in the wake of this tragedy are many. Was this a case of a broken system, where the warning signs were missed? Could Steven's actions have been predicted? Could Katie have been saved from his psychological grip? What's even more unsettling is the possibility that other families are out there, families where similar manipulation and control are happening behind closed doors. The Steven Pladl case serves as a chilling reminder that the darkest secrets are often hidden in plain sight. After Steven and Katie's incestuous relationship was discovered, they were both arrested. The court had ordered no contact between the two, as any further relationship was clearly illegal and dangerous. Yet, in a chilling twist, Steven and Katie continued their communication. Despite the law's best efforts to separate them, Katie and Steven found ways to maintain their disturbing connection. This is where the cracks in the system became most evident. The court orders, while clear, were not enforced with enough rigor. There were repeated warnings that the relationship between father and daughter was escalating, but these warnings were often overlooked. Steven's charm and manipulative behavior had convinced people around him that he was a grieving father trying to connect with his daughter, which clouded the severity of his intentions. The Pladl case was a wake-up call for many regarding the need for more effective protective measures in cases of family-related abuse, manipulation, and incest. There was a clear lack of coordination between law enforcement, the courts, and child protective services. Katie's tragic fate calls for reforms in how cases of this nature are handled. Katie's adoptive mother in particular struggled with intense guilt. She had always believed that Katie would be safe with her biological father. After all, who could have imagined that Steven's affection for his daughter would be turned into a violent obsession? Katie had left home to find herself, to reunite with her biological family, but her return would only bring devastation. We tried to give her the best life possible, but in the end, I feel like I failed her. If I had only known, maybe we could have stopped this. Katie Fusco's story is one of profound psychological pain. The events surrounding her life and tragic end are a testament to the complex emotional toll that manipulation, incest, and familial betrayal can have on an individual. Her journey through life, starting as an adopted child in a loving family and ending in the arms of her biological father, marked a series of emotional dislocations that left her lost and vulnerable. Bennett's death was the turning point that sealed the tragedy. He was an innocent child, born into a world of chaos. His birth, the result of an incestuous relationship, symbolized not only the abuse of power but also the failure of the system to protect a child who had no agency over his circumstances. After killing Bennett, Steven drove to Connecticut, where Katie lived with her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco. In what can only be described as an act of total disregard for life, Steven murdered both Katie and her adoptive father. After committing the murders of his daughter and her adoptive father, Steven fled the scene. His actions, however, were not those of someone trying to escape. He was on a mission to end everything, to finish what he had started. Just hours after the murders, Steven took his own life in New York, ending his reign of terror in a final, decisive act. His suicide left behind unanswered questions. Why had he gone this far? What drove him to such extremes? Was it guilt, or was it simply the culmination of his years of manipulation? What makes the Steven Pladl case particularly difficult to comprehend is the fact that this was a family. Steven was Katie's biological father, and yet his relationship with her was defined not by love or protection, but by control, manipulation, and violence. This raises an uncomfortable question. How could a father treat his daughter this way? Steven Pladl's story is one that left even the most seasoned investigators speechless. It was a case that not only violated the law, but also defied every human boundary of decency. His daughter Katie Rose was born when Steven was just a teenager. He had gotten her mother pregnant before she was even legally considered an adult. From the very beginning, his behavior around Katie was disturbing. According to the child's mother, Steven would pinch the baby constantly, sometimes hard enough to leave red marks. It was this kind of unsettling conduct that eventually pushed the mother to give Katie up for adoption, hoping the child would have a safer, more stable life elsewhere. Years passed. Steven and his wife had more children. They tried to move on. But when Katie turned 18, she reached out and found her birth parents online. It was supposed to be a reunion, a healing moment. But from the moment Katie moved in with them, things took a turn. Steven's behavior became possessive, controlling, unnatural. His wife noticed it, tried to caution both of them, but she had no idea just how deep it had gone. What she assumed was an overprotective father-daughter relationship had turned into something much darker. When the truth finally surfaced, she was horrified. This case serves as a shocking reminder of how deeply buried secrets can destroy lives. It's not just a tragic story, it's a call to action. What would you do in a similar situation? How would you confront a family member who has crossed the line into darkness? Drop your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Let's talk about how to spot the red flags and protect the ones we love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our true crime series. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and always look a little deeper. This is True Crime Diaries, where every story has a pulse.